Howling like a starved wolf against the splintering logs of the Higgins cabin, the wind served as a bitter reminder of the harsh 1,881 Colorado territory. Out here, winter wasn't just a season. It was an executioner. Sarah Higgins had 3 logs of firewood left, half a sack of weevilled flour, and 2 shivering children looking to her for a miracle. What she found buried in the snowdrift by the creek wasn't a miracle. It was a massive, bleeding man, fading fast from 2 bullet holes in his chest, clutching a leather satchel like it held his very soul. Saving him meant risking her children's last meager supplies. But she couldn't possibly know that the blood soaking into the snow was shed to protect a secret one that would change her family's destiny forever. The winter of 1881 was written into the history of the Colorado Territory as the Great White Morning. For Sarah Higgins, the morning had begun 8 months prior when a sudden, violent fever took her husband, Henry. He had been a good man, a hard-working farmer who believed the rich soil at the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains would yield a legacy for their children. Instead, it yielded a grave, leaving 28-year-old Sarah alone with 10-year-old James, 7-year-old Abigail, and a mountain of debt owed to the local land baron, Josiah Caldwell. On the morning of December 14th, the frost on the inside of the cabin windows was thick enough to scrape off with a spoon. Sarah wrapped her threadbare woolen shawl tighter around her narrow shoulders. Her hands, once soft and prone to playing the parlor piano back in Missouri, were now calloused, cracked, and stained with soot and soil. "Mama, my toes are numb," little Abigail whispered from the bed, her voice trembling. She was huddled beneath a patchwork quilt alongside her older brother, both of them fully dressed in their daytime clothes to stave off the biting chill. "I know, sweet bird," Sarah murmured, her heart twisting with a familiar suffocating panic. "I'm going to the creek to chop some fresh ice for water, and I'll bring back some kindling. You and James stay under those covers. Do not get out of bed." James, trying to be the man of the house, sat up slightly. "I can go, Mama. I can carry the axe." "You stay and keep your sister warm, James," Sarah commanded, gently but firmly. She pulled on her late husband's heavy leather boots, 2 sizes too big, and stuffed the toes with rags. Grabbing the heavy iron axe and a tin bucket, she pushed open the heavy oak door. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs, the icy crystals biting into her exposed cheeks. The world outside was an endless, blinding expanse of white, punctuated only by the skeletal silhouettes of dormant aspen trees. She trudged toward the frozen creek, her breath pluming in thick white clouds, her mind churning with the terrifying mathematics of survival. 2 days of flour left. Maybe 3, if she thinned the gruel with more water. She reached the creek bend, raising the axe to strike the ice, when she saw it. A smear of crimson against the pristine snow. Sarah froze, the axe heavy in her grip. Her first thought was a mountain lion, perhaps dragging a fresh kill. She tightened her grip on the handle, her eyes scanning the tree line. But there was no animal. Just a trail of deep drag marks leading toward a massive snowdrift beneath a cluster of dense pines. Cautiously, she followed the red trail. As she rounded the snowdrift, she gasped, dropping the tin bucket with a clatter. Lying face down in the snow was a man. He was enormous, clad in heavily fringed buckskin and a thick bearskin coat that was soaked dark with fresh blood. A wide-brimmed hat lay a few feet away, revealing a thick mane of dark, snow-dusted hair. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to run. The frontier was swarming with outlaws, deserters, and violent men, but as she took a step back, the man let out a ragged, agonizing groan. His massive hand twitched, his fingers digging into the frozen earth. "Lord help me," Sarah whispered. She dropped the axe and rushed to his side. It took all her meager strength to roll him over. When she did, she recoiled. His face was rugged, deeply tanned, and lined with hardship, but it was pale as a corpse beneath the dirt and ice. His breathing was wet and shallow, but it was his chest that drew her horrified gaze. 2 distinct bullet holes had shredded his heavy buckskin shirt, the dark blood freezing even as it seeped from the wounds. This was no hunting accident. Someone had tried to execute him. His eyes fluttered open, a striking, piercing shade of steel blue. They were unfocused, Wild with pain and delirium, his cracked lips moved. The deed. He rasped, his voice barely a gravelly whisper. Don't let... Caldwell. Sarah's blood ran colder than the winter air. Caldwell. Josiah Caldwell. The same man who had been riding out to her cabin every month, threatening to foreclose on her land, offering her pennies on the dollar to pack up her children and leave. The man's eyes rolled back and his head lolled to the side. He was unconscious, and he was dying. Sarah stood up, her chest heaving. If she left him, he would be dead in an hour. If she brought him inside, she was inviting the wrath of the men who shot him into her home. She looked back at her cabin, a tiny speck of smoke curling from the chimney. She thought of Henry, of how he had always told the children that kindness was the only thing that separated men from monsters in the wild. Damn it! Sarah swore, a rare curse slipping past her lips. She grabbed the collar of his heavy bearskin coat. She weighed perhaps 120 pounds, soaking wet. The man easily topped 220. She dug the heels of Henry's boots into the snow, leaned back and pulled. It was agonizing work. Every 10 yards, her lungs burned, her vision spotted with black dots, and her muscles screamed in protest. The snow, thankfully, provided a slick surface, but the incline up to the cabin was brutal. It took her 45 minutes to drag him the 100 yards to her porch. "James!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "James! Open the door!" The door flew open. James stood there, his eyes going wide with terror at the sight of the bloody giant on their porch. Little Abigail shrieked and hid behind her brother. "Don't just stand there, grab his legs," Sarah barked. Together, the exhausted widow and the terrified 10-year-old boy dragged the dying mountain man into the meager warmth of the cabin, shutting the door against the howling wind and the unseen dangers that were surely hunting him. The interior of the cabin quickly filled with the metallic scent of blood and the damp, earthy smell of wet fur. Sarah and James managed to heave the man onto the rug in front of the dying fire. "Mama, is he dead?" Abigail whimpered from the corner, clutching a ragged corn-husk doll to her chest. "No, Abby, but he's close," Sarah said, stripping off her coat. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a sharp, focused panic. "James, I need you to put the last 3 logs on the fire. Build it as hot as you can. Then fetch the iron kettle and melt the ice I brought in the bucket." As James rushed to obey, Sarah knelt beside the man. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He had a jagged scar running along his jawline, a testament to a harsh life lived outdoors. Strapped to his hip was a heavy Colt revolver, and a massive hunting knife was sheathed at his belt. His right hand was locked in a death grip around the strap of a worn leather satchel. She carefully pried his fingers loose, moving the satchel to the side, and then began the gruesome task of cutting away his blood-soaked shirt with a pair of sewing shears. The wounds were ugly. The bullets had entered his upper left chest and his right side. Miraculously, listening to the wheeze of his breath, Sarah didn't think they had punctured his lungs, but he was losing blood rapidly. "Mama, the water is boiling," James said, his voice shaking. "Bring it here, and bring my sewing box and the bottle of whiskey from your father's trunk," Sarah ordered. For the next 2 hours, the cabin became a makeshift surgical ward. Sarah had patched up Henry's farm injuries and birthed calves, but she had never dug lead out of a man's flesh. She sterilized her husband's small carving knife in the fire. The man, whoever he was deep in delirium. When Sarah poured the raw whiskey over his open wounds, his massive body arched off the floor, a guttural roar tearing from his throat that made the children clamp their hands over their ears. "Hold him down, James! Lean on his legs!" Sarah cried, her own hands slick with his blood. She dug for the bullets. The one in his side had passed clean through, but the one in his chest was lodged against a rib. When her makeshift forceps finally clinked against the lead, she let out a sob of relief, extracting the deformed lump of metal and tossing it into the bloody tin basin. She packed the wounds with clean rags torn from her last good petticoat and bound his chest tightly. Exhausted, she collapsed back onto her heels, wiping her sweaty forehead with the back of a bloody hand. By nightfall, the fever set in. The man thrashed on the floor, his skin burning to the touch despite the freezing drafts rattling the window panes. Sarah sent the children to bed, sitting vigil beside the stranger. She bathed his face with cold water, listening to his fractured, feverish ramblings. "They're coming! Caldwell's riders, he muttered, his head tossing side to side. Water rights. It's all in the valley. Don't sign. Sarah leaned in closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. Josiah Caldwell owned thousands of acres to the east, but he had been aggressively buying up small homesteads along the riverbed. Henry had always refused to sell, claiming their land had the best subterranean water access in the valley. A month after Henry died, Caldwell had shown up with a fake promissory note, claiming Henry owed him $500 a debt Sarah could never pay. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered to the unconscious man. She glanced at the leather satchel he had been clinging to. Invasion of privacy seemed a trivial concern given the circumstances. She unbuckled the flap and pulled out a stack of tightly folded papers. They were surveyor maps, incredibly detailed, covered in topographical lines and handwritten notes. There was a journal, too. She flipped it open to the front page. Property of Jeremiah Stone. She turned the pages. Jeremiah was a surveyor and a frontiersman, hired by the territorial government in Denver to map the water tables of the Sangre de Cristo valleys. And according to his notes, Josiah Caldwell had been illegally damming the upper river and falsifying property lines to starve the lower homesteaders of water, forcing them to sell, including the Higgins farm. Jeremiah had found the proof, and Caldwell had sent his men to silence him. A heavy hand suddenly clamped around Sarah's wrist like an iron vice. She gasped, dropping the journal. Jeremiah Stone's eyes were open. The fever still raged in them, but there was a terrifying, instinctual lucidity there as well. In a flash of movement that belied his grave injuries, his other hand shot to his hip, drawing the heavy Colt revolver and pointing it directly at her chest. "Where are they?" he growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Sarah froze, staring down the dark barrel of the gun. "You're safe," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, though her knees were trembling. "You're in my home." "I found you in the snow. I dug the bullets out of you." Jeremiah blinked, his breathing ragged. He looked around the dimly lit cabin, his gaze taking in the patched walls, the dying fire, and finally settling on Sarah. He saw her blood-stained hands, the bloody basin, and the sheer exhaustion etched into her young, pale face. Slowly, the tension left his jaw. The heavy revolver wavered, then lowered to the floor. He let go of her wrist, groaning in agony as the movement pulled at his stitches. "I reckon." Jeremiah wheezed, closing his eyes. "I owe you my life, ma'am." "My name is Sarah Higgins," she said quietly, picking up his journal and placing it back in the satchel. "And you owe me a new petticoat, Mr. Stone. Now, drink this water before you die of thirst and make my hard work entirely useless." For the first time, a faint ghost of a smile touched the corner of Jeremiah's cracked lips. "Yes, ma'am?" For the next 4 days, the winter storm raged outside, burying the cabin under 3 feet of snow. Inside, a fragile truce evolved into a quiet domestic rhythm. Jeremiah Stone was a man of few words, but his presence filled the small cabin. He was remarkably resilient. By the second day, though pale and moving with stiff, pained caution, he insisted on sitting up in the rocking chair by the fire. He watched Sarah move about the cabin, his sharp blue eyes taking in the desperate poverty of her situation, the watered-down porridge, the way she gave the larger portions to her children, and claimed she wasn't hungry, the way she meticulously mended the children's clothes by candlelight. On the third afternoon, James was sitting on the floor, trying to whittle a piece of firewood with a dull kitchen knife. Jeremiah watched him for a moment before clearing his throat. "Boy," Jeremiah said, his voice deep and raspy. James looked up, a bit intimidated by the giant man. "Yes, sir?" Jeremiah reached to his belt, unsheathed his massive, bone-handled hunting knife, and held it out, handle first, a man's only as good as the edge of his blade. "That butter knife's gonna slip and take your thumb off. Use this, but respect it." James's eyes widened with awe. He looked at his mother for permission. Sarah paused her, sweeping, looking from the dangerous weapon to the rugged mountain man. She nodded slowly. James took the knife reverently. Over the next hour, Jeremiah patiently guided the boy, teaching him how to carve the wood away from his body, his low voice a steady, calming rumble in the cabin. Little Abigail, who had been terrified of Jeremiah at first, eventually crept closer, fascinated by the wooden horse taking shape in her brother's hands. By evening, she was sitting cross-legged at Jeremiah's feet, asking him if he had ever seen a real live bear. "Seen one?" Jeremiah chuckled softly, wincing slightly at his chest. "Little miss, I wrestled one for this very coat. He won the dancing contest, but I won the coat." Abigail giggled, a bright, joyous sound that Sarah hadn't heard in the cabin since Henry died. Sarah turned away to the stove, hiding the sudden tears that pricked her eyes. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat across the hearth from Jeremiah. The firelight danced across his rugged features. "You read my journal," Jeremiah stated quietly. "It wasn't an accusation, just a fact." "I did," Sarah admitted, meeting his gaze. "I needed to know if the men who shot you were going to follow the blood trail to my door." Jeremiah sighed, shifting his weight. "Josiah Caldwell hired 3 men to trail me. They ambushed me up on the ridge. I took one down, but the other 2 got the drop on me. Left me for dead." He looked at Sarah, his eyes intense. "Caldwell wants this whole valley, Sarah. Your husband's land sits right on top of the primary aquifer. If he controls this farm, he controls the water for 50 miles in any direction." Sarah closed her eyes, the crushing weight of reality settling back onto her shoulders. "It doesn't matter. I can't fight him. I have no money. We are starving, Mr. Stone. In 2 days, we won't have anything left to eat. I was going to pack up the wagon and walk away. Let him have it." Jeremiah leaned forward, groaning as his ribs protested. He reached out, his large, rough hand gently covering her small, calloused one. The warmth of his touch sent a shockwave through her exhausted body. "You saved my life, Sarah Higgins. I ain't going to let you lose your home, and I ain't going to let these children starve." "You have 2 bullet holes in you," Sarah pointed out, a sad, cynical smile on her lips. "You can barely walk." "I can shoot," he said simply. The next morning, the wind finally died down. The snow stopped falling, leaving behind a blindingly bright, silent world. The stillness was beautiful, but to Sarah, it was terrifying. Clear skies meant clear trails. True to his word, Jeremiah forced himself up. Using an old broom handle as a cane, he bundled up in his bloody bearskin coat, loaded his rifle, and limped out the door. Sarah paced the cabin for 2 hours, sick with worry that he had collapsed in the snow, bleeding out all over again. But just before noon, the door swung open. Jeremiah stood there, swaying slightly from exhaustion, but in his left hand, he dragged a young buck deer. "Meat's back on the menu, ma'am," he grunted before collapsing into the snow on the porch. For the next week, the dynamic shifted. The venison restored the children's energy and brought color back to Sarah's cheeks. Jeremiah healed with the speed of a wild animal. As his strength returned, so did a quiet, undeniable bond between him and Sarah. They spent evenings talking about their lives. He told her about the vast emptiness of the high mountains, and she told him about her dreams of a peaceful life that had died with Henry. She found herself lingering near him, comforted by his immense, protective presence. He, in turn, looked at her with a profound, unspoken admiration. He had lived among the toughest men in the West, but he had never seen strength quite like the fierce, unyielding love of this widowed mother. But the fragile peace was an illusion. On the 10th day, the sun was shining, melting the snow off the pine branches in steady drips. Jeremiah was on the porch, chopping firewood with smooth, powerful swings of the axe, his wounds mostly scarred over. Sarah was inside, washing dishes, humming a tune she hadn't thought of in years. Suddenly, the chopping stopped. Sarah looked out the window. Jeremiah was standing perfectly still, the axe resting on the chopping block, his head tilted slightly, listening. His jaw was clenched, his blue eyes fixed on the southern trail leading up from the valley. Sarah opened the door, a cold dread washing over her. "Jeremiah? What is it?" He turned to her, his face a mask of grim determination. He reached down and unsnapped the leather holster of his Colt revolver. "Get the children, Sarah," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Hide them in the root cellar. Now." Through the melting snow, the faint rhythmic sound drifted up the valley. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Horses, multiple riders. Josiah Caldwell's men had found them. The rhythmic crunch of hooves on packed snow grew louder, echoing off the sheer granite faces of the Sangre de Cristo foothills. Inside the dimly lit cabin, the air grew thick with a suffocating tension. Sarah did not freeze. The fragile widow who had wept over a half-empty flour sack a fortnight ago was gone, replaced by a fierce mother whose sanctuary was under siege. She hoisted the heavy wooden trapdoor in the center of the floorboards, revealing the dark, earthen-smelling root cellar. "James, Abigail, down you go. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear," Sarah commanded, her voice devoid of panic. James hesitated, clutching the wooden horse Jeremiah had helped him carve. "Mama, what about you?" "I will be right here," she promised, pressing a swift kiss to his forehead before gently pushing him down the ladder. Abigail followed, whimpering softly. Sarah dropped the heavy trapdoor and kicked the braided rug over it. Outside, Jeremiah stood perfectly still on the porch. The cold wind ruffled the heavy fur of his bearskin coat. He didn't run for the trees. To do so would draw the riders' attention away, perhaps, but it would leave Sarah and the cabin undefended if they decided to search the place. He slid the heavy axe behind the chopping block, out of immediate sight, and slipped his thumb over the hammer of his Colt. 5 men rode into the clearing. At the center was Josiah Caldwell. He was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. Clad in a tailored broadcloth suit beneath a heavy buffalo hide duster, he rode a magnificent dappled gray stallion that pranced nervously in the unfamiliar snow. Flanking him were 4 hardened men, hired guns with flat, dead eyes. Sarah recognized 2 of them from town, Jebediah Miller, a known cattle rustler, and Cole Hackett, a man who had once shot a dog just for barking at his horse. The other 2 were strangers, one a grizzled tracker named Amos, the other a young, jittery kid with his hand hovering over his sidearm. "Mrs. Higgins!" Caldwell called out, his voice smooth and heavily oiled with false sympathy. He didn't seem to notice the giant of a man standing in the shadows of the porch overhang just yet. "Are you in there, Sarah?" Sarah opened the heavy oak door and stepped out onto the porch, stopping just ahead of Jeremiah's concealed position. She crossed her arms against the biting chill, her eyes blazing. "I told you last month, Mr. Caldwell. You are not welcome on this property," Sarah said, her voice ringing clear across the snowy yard. Caldwell chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He patted his horse's neck. "Now, Sarah, is that any way to treat a neighbor who only wants to help? I know times are hard. I know Henry left you with debts you can't possibly pay. I've brought the foreclosure papers. It breaks my heart, truly it does, but the bank won't wait forever. Sign the deed over to me today, and I'll give you a wagon and $100 to get you and your little ones back to Missouri." "You don't own the bank, Josiah, and Henry owed you nothing," Sarah spat back, "and I know why you want this land so badly. It isn't about farming. It's about the water." Caldwell's pleasant facade cracked. His eyes narrowed, taking in the freshly chopped wood and the bloodstains on the snow that the recent melt had uncovered. "You've been listening to rumors, widow, and it looks like you've been entertaining company." Amos, the grizzled tracker, pointed a thick, gloved finger toward the shadows of the porch. "Boss, look at the size of them boots." Jeremiah Stone stepped forward into the harsh midday light. The reaction was instantaneous. The hired guns stiffened, their hands dropping to their holsters. Caldwell's face drained of color. He had paid good money to see Jeremiah Stone buried under 3 feet of mountain dirt. "You," Caldwell whispered, his horse dancing backward from the sudden tension in his reins. "You're supposed to be dead." "Takes more than back-shooting cowards to kill a mountain man," Jeremiah rumbled, his steel blue eyes locking onto Caldwell. "I've still got my journal, Josiah. I've got the surveyor maps. And the territorial governor in Denver is going to be mighty interested in how you've been damming the upper river and forging property lines." Caldwell's panic quickly morphed into ruthless pragmatism. He couldn't leave witnesses. Not the surveyor, and certainly not the widow who now knew too much. "Kill them both," Caldwell barked, spurring his horse backward toward the safety of the tree line. "Burn the cabin with the brats inside." Hell broke loose in the quiet valley. Jeremiah moved with terrifying speed. He shoved Sarah back through the doorway, his massive arm knocking her safely inside, just as a volley of gunfire erupted. Bullets chewed into the thick pine logs of the cabin, raining deadly wooden splinters onto the porch. Jeremiah didn't retreat inside immediately. He drew his Colt, dropping to one knee beside the heavy water barrel. He fired twice. The young, jittery kid was blown clean out of his saddle, his foot catching in the stirrup as his panicked horse bolted into the woods. "Get away from the windows!" Jeremiah roared to Sarah, finally diving backward into the cabin and kicking the heavy door shut. He threw the iron deadbolt into place just as another slug buried itself in the wood. Inside, the noise was deafening. Sarah crawled across the floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't cower. She crawled straight to the long wooden chest at the foot of her bed. Throwing it open, she bypassed the quilts and pulled out Henry Sharp's buffalo rifle and a heavy box of brass cartridges. "Jeremiah!" she called out, tossing him a spare Winchester repeater from the wall rack. He caught it smoothly, flashing her a look of profound respect. "Take the back window. Don't let them flank us." Outside, the 3 remaining gunmen had dismounted and taken cover behind the snowdrifts and the remnants of Henry's stone wall. Jebediah Miller laid down a suppressing fire, his bullets shattering the front windows. Glass rained down on the cabin floor. "We got 'em pinned!" Cole Hackett yelled over the gunfire. "Amos, circle round the back! Flush 'em out!" Sarah heard the crunch of boots on the snow behind the cabin. She hoisted the heavy Sharp's rifle, resting the barrel on the sill of the shattered back window. Her hands shook violently, but she thought of James and Abigail huddled in the dark, cold earth below her feet. She took a deep breath, steadying her aim. Amos peeked his head around the corner of the woodshed, his rifle raised. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The Sharp's rifle kicked like a mule, slamming hard into her bruised shoulder, but the deafening roar was followed by a sharp cry of pain outside. Amos dropped his weapon, clutching his shattered shoulder, and scrambled blindly into the woods. "Backside is clear!" Sarah shouted, reloading the single-shot rifle with trembling, soot-stained fingers. In the front, Jeremiah was a force of nature. Despite his healing wounds, he moved from window to window, laying down precise, calculated fire. He wasn't just shooting, he was hunting. He waited for Cole Hackett to break cover to reload. When Hackett stood, Jeremiah fired once. The outlaw crumpled into the snow, dead before he hit the ground. Jebediah Miller, realizing the odds had drastically turned against them, lost his nerve. He threw down his rifle, scrambled over the stone wall, and ran toward the horses. Jeremiah tracked him with the Winchester, but lowered the barrel, letting the coward run. The gunfire ceased. The sudden silence in the valley was ringing and absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind and the nervous snorting of Caldwell's abandoned horse. "Caldwell," Jeremiah said softly, his eyes scanning the tree line. "He didn't run. He's too proud." Jeremiah reloaded his Colt and looked at Sarah. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." "Jeremiah, wait," Sarah pleaded, grabbing his arm. "He's dangerous." "So am I," Jeremiah replied quietly. He opened the door and stepped out into the bloody snow. Jeremiah tracked Caldwell's expensive leather boots through the snow. The footprints led away from the horses and toward the old half-collapsed barn at the edge of the property. Caldwell, in his panic, had boxed himself in. Jeremiah approached the barn with the silent, predatory grace of the mountain lion he had been compared to. He slipped through the ruined double doors, stepping into the gloom. The air smelled of old hay and rot. "It's over, Josiah," Jeremiah's voice echoed in the rafters. "Your men are dead or gone. You're walking back to town with me, and we're waiting for the U.S. Marshal." A shot rang out from the loft. The bullet grazed Jeremiah's shoulder, tearing through his coat. Jeremiah didn't flinch. He fired blindly into the hayloft, intentionally shooting wide to force Caldwell into a corner. "Stop! Stop shooting!" Caldwell screamed, his voice cracking with terror. He slowly stood up, his hands raised, dropping a silver-plated derringer onto the hay. He looked pathetic, his expensive duster covered in dust and cobwebs. Jeremiah climbed the rickety ladder, his gun trained squarely on the land baron's chest. He grabbed Caldwell by the collar and hauled him down to the ground floor, throwing him violently into the dirt. Sarah, unable to wait in the cabin, appeared in the doorway of the barn, holding the Sharp's rifle at her side. Caldwell looked up at her, wiping blood from a scratch on his cheek. His arrogance was gone, replaced by the desperate, frantic spite of a trapped rat. "You think you've won, Sarah?" Caldwell sneered, spitting dirt from his mouth. "You think you're going to keep this land? You can't farm it alone." Henry couldn't even do it, and he was a strong man. "Henry was twice the man you'll ever be," Sarah said coldly. Caldwell let out a bitter, wicked laugh. Henry was a stubborn fool. He wouldn't sell. Even when I told him the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad was coming through this valley. Even when I told him they needed the water rights to build the steam station. Sarah froze. The railroad? Millions of dollars, Sarah, Caldwell gasped, looking at Jeremiah's gun with wide eyes. The railroad is paying top dollar for land with access to the subterranean aquifer. That's why I needed it. But Henry, he just wouldn't drink the whiskey I poured him, would he? He was too pious. The air in the barn grew instantly freezing. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What did you say? Caldwell, realizing his slip of the tongue, scrambled backward in the dirt. I didn't mean... You poisoned him, Sarah whispered, the horrifying realization crashing down upon her. The sudden fever, the agonizing stomach cramps. The way the town doctor couldn't explain the suddenness of Henry's death, it hadn't been an illness. It had been murder. A raw, animalistic sound tore from Sarah's throat. She raised the heavy Sharps rifle, pointing it directly at Caldwell's face. Her hands were no longer shaking. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Sarah, don't, Jeremiah said quietly. He didn't move to stop her physically, but his deep voice cut through the red haze of her fury. Don't ruin your soul for a piece of garbage like him. The rope will do the job for you. A legal hanging is what he deserves. Let him swing in front of the whole town. Sarah stared at Caldwell, her eyes swimming with tears of grief and rage. For a long, agonizing minute, the balance of life and death hung in the dusty air of the barn. Slowly, she lowered the rifle. Get him out of my sight, she choked out, turning her back on the man who had destroyed her family. 2 days later, the U.S. Marshal arrived from Pueblo, summoned by a telegraph Jeremiah had forced the local postmaster to send. Josiah Caldwell was taken away in irons, facing federal charges of murder, attempted murder, land fraud, and water rights violations. Governor Frederick Walker Pitkin himself sent a representative to collect Jeremiah's maps, assuring the widow that her land was undeniably hers. More importantly, the railroad representative arrived a week later. Learning that Sarah held the sole legal rights to the largest aquifer in the valley, they offered her a contract that would make her one of the wealthiest women in the Colorado Territory. She wouldn't have to sell the farm. She simply had to lease the water access. Spring finally broke over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The snow melted, revealing the rich, dark soil Henry had loved so much. Sarah stood on the porch, watching James and Abigail chase a new puppy around the yard, a gift from the marshal. The cabin had a new roof, new glass in the windows, and the pantry was overflowing. But as she watched the road, her heart ached with a familiar, hollow pain. Jeremiah Stone was packing his horse. He was fully healed, wearing a new buckskin shirt and his trademark bearskin coat. He tightened the cinch on his saddle, giving his horse a gentle pat before turning toward the cabin. He walked up the porch steps, taking off his wide-brimmed hat. "Well, Mrs. Higgins," Jeremiah said, his voice unusually tight, "the thaw is here, the passes are clear. I reckon my job for the governor isn't quite finished. Still got the northern valleys to map." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes tracing the rugged lines of his face, the jagged scar, the piercing blue eyes that had seen her at her absolute lowest and helped pull her to the top. "Do you have to go?" she asked, her voice betraying a vulnerability she had sworn to hide. Jeremiah looked away, staring up at the majestic peaks of the mountains. "I'm a wanderer, Sarah. I map the wild places. I don't know how to sleep in a soft bed. I don't know how to stay still. I'd only bring you grief." "You brought me life, Jeremiah." Sarah stepped closer, reaching out to gently touch the leather of his coat. "You saved my children. You avenged my husband. You taught my son how to use a knife and my daughter how to laugh again." He looked back at her, his expression torn. "You're a wealthy woman now. You can go back to Missouri. Live in a fine house. Play the piano." "I don't want to go to Missouri," Sarah said fiercely. "I belong here. This is my home. But a home is awfully quiet when it's just the three of us." Jeremiah Stone, the giant of the mountains, a man who had stared down outlaws and wrestled bears, seemed utterly defenseless against the soft, honest gaze of the widow Higgins. He dropped his hat onto the porch floor. Slowly, his massive hands came up to cup her face. His thumbs gently wiped away a stray tear from her cheek. "I reckon," Jeremiah whispered, a slow, genuine smile breaking across his rugged face, The northern valleys can wait. Someone needs to teach that boy how to shoot properly. Sarah smiled, leaning into his touch, as the warm spring wind swept through the valley, carrying away the ghosts of the winter and bringing the promise of a new, beautiful frontier. What an incredible journey of resilience and justice. From a desperate widow on the brink of freezing to a wealthy, empowered landowner, Sarah Higgins proved that the frontier spirit is truly unbreakable. And Jeremiah Stone, the lone mountain man who thought he had no place in the world, finally found a home and a family worth fighting for. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest miracles arrive in the most unexpected and dangerous ways. If Sarah and Jeremiah's fight for survival kept you on the edge of your seat, be sure to hit that like button and share this tale of Wild West romance with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling historical stories. What was your favorite moment from the siege at the cabin? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.